Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about 1 Thessalonians.
First Thessalonians is another one of these letters written by the Apostle Paul to a church that he founded. In this case, that church is in Thessalonica, which is a super ancient, very Greek city that had played a role in all kinds of the comings and goings and warfare and politics of the ancient Greek world and the dealings with the Persians when they came and went. So this town is a big deal. It's very cosmopolitan. There are people from all over the world who live there. And there's also a Jewish synagogue there. So on Paul's second missionary journey, which is recorded in part in Acts chapter 17, Paul and his buddy Silas show up in Thessalonica, and apparently they do what they were doing at any of these towns where there was a Jewish presence. They went first to the synagogue, and they would reason there with the Jewish people. Paul spoke their language, both literally and figuratively. And it says that in Thessalonica, there was a pretty good response. Some of those Jews were persuaded that their Messiah had indeed arrived. The promised king of David is here, the one who would crush the head of the serpent, promised all the way back in the beginning of Genesis. He has arrived. God's Spirit will now dwell among us. And so they were going to be pretty excited. But a lot of other Jewish people weren't as excited about it. More on that in a minute. In addition to that, Acts chapter 17 tells us that a bunch of God-fearers, those being people who believed that the God of the Jews was the real God, but they weren't Jewish ethnically themselves, says a bunch of them signed up to follow Christ as well. And then it also says that a whole bunch of Gentiles signed up to follow Christ as well. And then it also says that more than a few very prominent women leaders in the community became Christians as well. This all happened very, very quickly, maybe in 49 or 50 AD. But then the story takes a turn and echoes the same stuff that happened back in Jerusalem with Jesus. A bunch of the Jewish people who did not acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah there in Thessalonica, they round up some people and create a riot, and they go and they say to the magistrates and the leaders that the same thing that happened in Jerusalem is happening here. This Jesus fellow was claiming to be a rival king to Caesar, and we can't have that. Well, now this is just as disingenuous in Thessalonica as it was back when it happened to Jesus in Jerusalem. The Jews did not like Rome. And they certainly didn't acknowledge the Roman emperor as the Roman emperor thought of himself as a god. They threw riots over stuff like this. They threatened mass public ritual suicide in front of the governor's office in Caesarea over something that just looked like the image, the portrait of the emperor being too close to the temple. No, and to their credit, the Jews took idolatry very, very seriously, and they were not fans of the emperor in this regard. So the accusations that are getting thrown at Jesus and now at Paul from the Jewish people, it comes off as really disingenuous, but it's enough to create all kinds of political pressure. Paul has to flee. Silas stays put. What all of this means is that Thessalonica was a church founded in turmoil. It was born out of immediate resistance. And further, because of this, their training was incomplete. They didn't get a year or 2 years like Corinth or Ephesus got. They just got a tiny little bit of time before Paul had to get out of there. So it shouldn't come as a surprise then that Paul felt compelled to write to the Thessalonian church very quickly after he was gone from there to continue to nurture them and encourage them because he understood what they were giving up to follow Jesus. This was very, very costly. There's this thing that we see happen again and again through the early age of Christianity, where these Roman emperors would want to assert the cult of themselves from time to time. And they'd be like, I don't like all these other rival deities. We're going to do a thing where we just make everybody go and burn some incense in the pagan Roman religious practice to me, a living God. And you do that for, solidarity and unity in the empire to say, hey, we're all in it together. Just make this one public gesture, even if it doesn't make sense to you, and even if it doesn't really do anything, make this gesture to show that we're together on this, even if you worship a different God. Come on, it's not that big a deal. It's just a pinch of incense. Just do the pinch of incense. Why are you making it such a big thing? And in the first few hundred years of Christianity, some Christians were like, yeah, it's just a pinch of incense, whatever. Let's just show that we're all in it together. Fine, here you go. Others were like, no, it's idolatry, and I don't acknowledge that God, and I'm not going to do it. And generally speaking, they suffered terribly for refusing to do that. But for you and me living so far after this point in history, we can look at that and be like, what? It doesn't matter. Like, who cares if you twizzle together some flakes of something that smells good over a little piece of fire in some dumb building that doesn't matter? Who cares? But my friends, when you think about the things that go on in the world today, you know that stuff means stuff. And from time to time, culture gets an idea in its head, and it's like, hey, we need to see this to know that you're normal and that you're in on our thing, even if that thing is complete doublespeak or laughable dishonesty. This isn't just an ancient world thing. This isn't just an us thing. This is a human culture thing. Well, along comes Paul with the message of Jesus in Thessalonica, and the mere existence of the claims of Christ, when lined up against all of the convenient lies and myths that they tell each other there, it undermines all of that, and it is a threat to it. So in that regard, I suppose the Jewish agitators were somewhat right in their accusation. Thus, the occasion for this letter. It's not a real long one. All we're getting here content-wise is half of the letter with Paul just saying how grateful he is that this church exists and acknowledging that he understands how costly it was for the people who founded this church and became a part of it to do so. He essentially acknowledges the pain of the relationships they lost and the social cost of that, but then points to the relationship that he has with them and that they have with each other and other Christians in this new family of faith, and he points to the transcendence of that. In the second half of the letter, Paul is addressing the pressures they're going to continue to feel. They're right there in the hotbed of Greek and Roman thought. They're not participating in any of the convenient cultural lies anymore. That makes people irrationally angry and hateful toward them. They have voluntarily become the repugnant cultural other to their neighbors. And so in this second part, Paul is saying you're going to feel pressure to do things that look like the things your neighbors do that make sense for them in light of their assumptions about the world, but that don't make sense for you in light of your assumptions about the world rooted in Christ. So you're going to do things differently when it comes to sexuality, and he paints a picture of right marital monogamous relationships. Further, he goes on to say that they're set apart for good works, like he was talking about back in the book of Ephesians, and that generosity is part of that. They're going to need to look out for each other and be generous to people in need. And both of these cultural distinctives are going to flow out of the assumptions that come with being a follower of Jesus. But then there's an obvious question that Paul needs to address in the second half of this book. I mean, hey, we're changing what we do. We're living differently from our neighbors. That's going to be very costly. When does this whole thing shake out where Jesus comes back? And what about those of us who've already died before Jesus' return? It seems like they were very curious about that, and understandably so. We get the sense throughout the New Testament that people were really anticipating Jesus coming back within their lifetimes, and there being a reckoning for all of this injustice and ugly stuff that had been inflicted on them. But, well, as we know at this point, it didn't happen in that time frame, and this is one of the places where Paul speaks to that, and he talks about this Old Testament idea of the day of the Lord, and in the same way that the Old Testament prophets looked way forward to say there is a grand day of the Lord coming, so Paul looks forward to say there is a grand day of the Lord coming when this stuff will get sorted out and when the dead in Christ will be raised. He talks about literal resurrection and participating in this glorious day of the Lord, the reckoning, the return of Christ, the second coming of Christ. And I'm sure that sounded both very foreign to that original audience, but also wildly encouraging to that original audience, and very much in keeping with the themes that had been developed and that are still hanging out there from the Old Testament. No doubt people were like, cool, can you give us the time when that's going to happen, though, so we can just set our pace and endure up to that point. But in response to that implicit question, Paul echoes the words of Jesus in Matthew 24, saying, we don't know the day or the hour when all of this stuff is going to happen. And then he takes that to its logical conclusion and in so many words says, therefore, we're going to live expectantly, like that day of the Lord is now, like that day of the Lord is always happening. The knowledge that this return is coming has to inform how we live in the interim. So again, at the simplest level, the first half of the book is Paul thanking God for the faithfulness of this fledgling Thessalonian church. And the second half of the book is Paul praying for the love and steadfastness and set-apartedness from the pressures of the culture for the people there in Thessalonica as they expectantly await the return of Christ. When you visualize the book of 1 Thessalonians, picture Paul's description of Jesus descending from heaven. When you think about the theme, reflect on responding to the world's pressures with hopeful, expectant living. And if you don't have time to check out the whole thing, make sure you at least read chapter 4. Let us congratulate each other. We have leveled up our 1 Thessalonians game, and unsurprisingly, we got 2 Thessalonians next time around. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.